we're never going to have an equal world, but we can have more opportunity. And then let us see what type of things can be developed and what type of productivity we can really create when everyone feels like they have a seat at the table. That's the world I think Bitcoin can create.
Welcome back to Gen Z Unplugged. Today, we sit down with Natalie Brunell, host of Coin Stories, which is the #1 Bitcoin podcast in the world, and she's also the author of Bitcoin is for Everyone. Natalie spoke at the Luce Center last week on her new book and all things crypto, and this conversation reveals what an investigative journalist learned about cryptocurrency. If you are familiar with crypto or you know nothing about it at all, or you don't really care, we really encourage you to listen to this conversation, and we think you'll really enjoy it because there's a lot more to the world of finance, of economics, even of culture when it comes to cryptocurrency. So we really hope you enjoy. All right, Natalie, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, well, I'm excited to get into this conversation, to talk about Bitcoin, talk about crypto, talk about your history in the crypto space. But first, I'd love to just hear about you, even down like your childhood, your background. I know you have a background in investigative journalism. So hearing all about that and kind of how you got up to this point.
Sure. So I'm a first generation immigrant. My family is from Poland, and we came to this country when I was very young. I was 5. And I grew up listening to stories of my parents talk about what it was like to live under communism. And there was no sense of economic hope or social mobility. There were a lot of constraints because the government controlled everything, including the media. And my parents had to wait in lines for basic necessities. And sometimes they would get up to the front of the line and they would run out of whatever was needed, whether it was food or something for the home. And so I can't relate to that because I've never lived that. But hearing my parents' stories, I think really left an impression on me. And they came here in pursuit of the American dream. They didn't ask for anything in return, just the chance to be able to work hard and provide a better life for their kids. So my brother and me came and we went off to school and we were told, get an education. You can make anything happen here. And I went off to college, and then the great financial crisis hit. And I would say that that was probably the moment that shaped me the most, in ways that I didn't even realize until much later. But seeing my family who had worked so hard lose everything. We lost our house. My parents filed for bankruptcy. And then you see the bankers, the folks that took all this risk, they got bailed out. Some of them got bonuses. It really shifts your perception about the American dream and is it within reach? And why did my family, who played by all the rules, end up getting the rug pulled out from under them? So that informed, I think, a little bit of my desire to be an investigative journalist because I wanted to root out the corruption and I wanted to put a spotlight on the injustices that I saw in the system. I felt like there was so much. It was unfair that the average person was working so hard and feeling like they can't get ahead. And as I became a reporter, which I was working at various networks for about 10 years, I learned that my family was not the only one that went through this. There were a lot of Americans who had started to feel very little hope for the future. Everything was becoming more expensive. Wages and incomes were not keeping up. And there was something fundamentally broken that was also starting to pull us apart politically. And so I didn't know I was looking for Bitcoin. And when I discovered it, I was just as skeptical as everyone else. It was about 2017. I assumed it's digital, it can be hacked or replicated. But someone gave me a book to study Bitcoin. And the book was actually about money, it was about our financial system. And it kind of inspired my book eventually. But it really taught me that the system is fundamentally broken. You can print money, but you can't print more Bitcoin. And the printing of money that we've done in this country, the amount of debt that we've gone into has diluted every single dollar that we work so hard to earn. And we have no say in that. We have no say in that system. And that system benefits a few people and disadvantages pretty much everyone else. And so once I learned that and was empowered with that, I just went really far down the rabbit hole studying Bitcoin to see if it was a possible solution. And I came to the conclusion that it is the best solution available to save the average person from this monetary debasement and from the lack of hope and from the lack of economic empowerment. And that's why I want to educate everybody I can about both the financial system and Bitcoin.
Okay, you mentioned something interesting of realizing that the system was unfair and unjust, and I think a lot of people, their reaction is that their reaction to that is more on the socialist side. But you mentioned that your parents grew up under communism, and you saw that that wasn't going to succeed. So obviously, I assume that that had a lot to do. But was there any point where you said, "Okay, well, we need to be redistributing the wealth," or you had kind of that mindset, or did you go way to the opposite end of, oh my gosh, the entire system is broken and we need a whole type of currency? What was your thought process?
Yeah, so this is what's really interesting. I did grow up hearing again about communism, this
Mhm.
total over control by the government. But by the time I had reached college and the great financial crisis happened, I really empathized with the Occupy Wall Street movement. I thought the system is unfair and there needs to be this benevolent actor to come in, maybe the government, and redistribute the wealth because it's so unfair that the rich had gotten so rich and the poor, the working class, were suffering so much when they were working harder than ever. But that went to show you how little I understood about economics at the time
Mhm.
because our schools really don't teach us that. They really don't teach financial literacy. They don't teach us what money is, what the history of money is, who issues the money, how does our banking system work, who gets the money when it's printed at the Federal Reserve and the Treasury level. And I think once you're empowered with that information, you start to, pull back the layers and say, "Oh, well, this is why things have gotten more expensive, and this is why there's this wealth divide and wealth gap, and you can't fix it by doing more of the same. You can't fix it by introducing more government, more intervention, more money printing, more spending. You actually have to do something fundamentally different, and I think that scares people. But really, I think we just need to expose ourselves to something um, different from the way we've been responding to all these financial crises. We need to
Mhm.
look at other solutions as opposed to just fighting between ourselves. Because, frankly, I mean, no matter who's been in office, our debt has continued to go up. The cost of living has continued to go up, and the average person feels more and more like they can't keep up with where things are going. So, this isn't like a one party problem,
Yeah.
but I do think that, there are values that align very closely with Bitcoin that are conservative,
Mhm.
which is really a smaller government and more checks and balances and accountability.
Yeah, so interesting. And I think people don't understand how much crypto or just an alternative form of government plays into the conservative principle of a smaller, more controlled
Yeah.
government. So that's really interesting. And I want to bring up this because I think this is pretty funny. So, Natalie last year wore a dress to the crypto ball in DC that said "Fix the Money." And it was kind of a play off of AOC's infamous Tax the Rich dress,
Yeah.
which I think is such an interesting comparison, like juxtaposition. So, could you just briefly explain why taxing the rich is not the solution to fixing our problems in the US?
Well, I think it's an important conversation to be having now because we're seeing experiments play out, not just in the US, but across the world, where they're trying to implement these high billionaires taxes or millionaires taxes, and look what people are doing. They're actually fleeing with the money. And
Mhm.
so the governments that are wanting more to be able to spend more are actually getting a reduction of revenue. And who are they going to end up taxing? They're going to be taxing eventually the average person. And plus, all of these legislation proposals, they never account for the fact that inflation does happen. So
Yeah.
when the income tax was introduced, it was supposed to only, apply to a small percentage of people. And now look at us. Half of us are giving up like 30-40% of our paychecks to the government. And yet we see a deterioration in our standard of living and the services that we get back. So something, again, is broken. And I think the other thing about it is it's a very coercive statement to say, tax the rich. I'm going to take from you what you've built. I have the right to it.
Mhm.
And I would flip that on its head and say that property rights, what I earn, I should be able to keep as much of as possible, and it should be a more voluntary system. And so, fix the money, I think, represents that. It is a more voluntary, opt into a peaceful network where there is no inflation, where there is no coercion, where there
Mhm.
is no manipulation, and let the economy be dictated by merit and value and true competition, which is not the reality that we live in right now.
Right. And you mentioned inflation a couple of times there. So I want to help people understand why Bitcoin specifically is the solution to that. So can we back up a little bit and can you kind of just give an overview of what crypto is, what Bitcoin is specifically, and then why Bitcoin solves that issue of inflation?
Okay, well, I'll start with Bitcoin because I do like to make a distinction between Bitcoin and greater crypto. Bitcoin was in so many ways a technological breakthrough
Mhm.
that is the result of decades of development and research in the computer science arena. They were trying to create essentially a peer to peer form of money that's digital to the internet, that you didn't need an intermediary. Because when we think about it today, I mean, most of us, we don't use cash anymore. We use, credit
Mhm.
cards, and we have our balances in our bank account that we transfer. But we don't realize that behind the scenes is this web of all of these different banks and settlement networks and middlemen that are taking a cut and also surveilling you and basically offering you permission to spend your own money.
Mm.
And so, what the developers that eventually led to the creation of Bitcoin wanted was something that removed all of that, where it was a peer to peer system completely digitally. And Bitcoin ended up being that solution that ended up working and growing to a mass scale. And so, what it is it's two things actually. It's both an open, permissionless, and global monetary network. So, think of it as the internet,
Mhm.
or I call it the internet of money, and a lot of people in the space do too. But then within that internet, there's actually a token, the Bitcoin,
Mhm.
that can move along that internet and be exchanged peer to peer. So again, I can send you money, or I can send someone that's literally a continent away money, and it will settle and be verified by the network in as little as a few seconds or as much as about 10 minutes, which is just so crazy to think about, right? We've never had something like
Yeah.
this. It is a true digital bearer instrument that you can also take self custody of. So I can become my own bank. And this is very new for people, right? This is what I struggled with at the beginning because it's like, well, it's digital. Everything digital can be replicated. But when you dig into the Bitcoin network, you see that this just amazing consensus mechanism was designed with that finite supply coded, like hard coded in the software, saying this is how the Bitcoin network will be distributed, how the transactions will work, and this is the finite supply that we're going to have.
Mhm.
So I like to just summarize it as it is the best savings technology that has ever been invented. It is both money and an asset. Increasingly, I think people will use it as money, and it's just a way for you to opt out of the broken system that's controlled by governments and banks into one that is really the people's money, that's verified by the network at large, that anyone can use no matter where you are. It's accessible to everyone. Crypto at large, it's part of this larger industry that has a ton of different tokens. I urge caution because a lot of them are very speculative. And the difference is that most of them are not like Bitcoin in that they have an issuer.
Mhm.
So, Bitcoin is an asset with no issuer, it's a commodity. Similar to gold or oil. And a lot of the other cryptos do have issuers. They might have foundations or teams behind them that can influence the protocol or they market it. And so there's a little bit of risk in that, right? A lot of them are more similar to securities rather than commodities, and there's some debate there about which are which. But Bitcoin really has not only the largest market cap, but the largest distribution that makes it sufficiently decentralized. And that's why it has, it's like the Mount Everest compared to grains of sand for most of these other cryptos in terms of the usage and how much money is actually flowing into them. So I urge caution with crypto. Bitcoin is the best savings technology ever invented. And what was the last question?
How does it address the issue of inflation?
So, great question. Bitcoin is immune to inflation because, again, it was coded to have a finite supply of just 21 million. And it's a programmatic schedule. And so the last Bitcoin is not actually going to be mined until 2140. And every 4 years, the amount of Bitcoin that comes into circulation gets cut in half. So it's disinflationary, and no one can change that. So today in our system, we deal mostly with fiat currencies that our governments control, and they print as much as they want of it. And that's the huge problem, because inflation of the actual money supply is what dilutes the purchasing power of every single individual unit.
Mm.
With Bitcoin, one of the reasons why when you zoom out, it is volatile, but it goes up in purchasing power over the years is because each unit is worth more and more, since the demand is growing, but the supply is staying the same.
And there's only going to be 21 million.
Yeah.
So how was that number chosen?
I mean, there's debates there about
Mhm.
how Satoshi Nakamoto, who's the pseudonymous creator of Bitcoin, came to that number, and some of that I think has to do with just the calculations he made about how it's going to scale. And each Bitcoin is divisible into 100 million Satoshis. So actually, there's going to be a lot of Satoshis out there, and if we reach somehow a world where we're on the Bitcoin standard, I think everything will be denominated in Satoshis and not Bitcoin. But it is, I think people look at it and they think, oh, I need to have a whole Bitcoin. No, you can start accumulating $5 worth or $10 worth, whatever you can afford. I recommend dollar cost averaging, just like you do within a 401k account, like little by little, because you don't need a whole Bitcoin. And a fun fact is there are actually more millionaires in the world than there are Bitcoin. So not every millionaire
Mm.
will be able to have one Bitcoin. And we're so early. This is an asset class that is hitting an addressable market of 8 billion people,
Mhm.
and we've only got an adoption rate of like 100 million right now. So it's growing, and it's growing fast, but we've got a long way to go.
Interesting. And because, we speak to Gen Z women specifically, obviously our generation is extremely familiar with the internet. I
Yes.
mean, we grew up using computers, and even the youngest Gen Z, they grew up with iPhones, so young, like 8 years old or
Yeah.
something like that. So have you seen Gen Z be a little more receptive to Bitcoin than maybe the older generations are because we're so familiar with the internet?
Totally. And I
Mhm.
want to give a big shout out to two of my favorite Gen Z Bitcoiners, Ella Huff and Halston Valencia,
Mhm.
because they are really trailblazing and helping their generation understand this technology. And of course, yeah, your generation is digitally native and you
Mhm.
grew up with these devices. And so the idea of digital money is not very hard to embrace. Sometimes, older generations, yeah, they're a little skeptical because it's all digital. But I think for younger generations, they know that the whole world is moving in this direction. We're so interconnected. Banking is all online today.
Mhm.
You could do business today with people in another country, right? The world is opened up through the internet. And I think Bitcoin is going to open it up in so many more economic ways
Mhm.
and allow for more people to have opportunity, because again, it's this open, permissionless system. So for young people, what's incredible is I think it's restoring a lot of hope, because this current system has placed such a debt burden, especially on, the American young generation, that I think a lot of people have looked to the future and thought, how am I going to afford a house? How am I going to afford to get out of, student loan debt?
Mhm.
Much less think about having a family and what that costs. And that can breed a sense of nihilism and disconnection. And I think all of us have sensed that, right? And I do think that a lot of those core reasons are economic, because people don't feel a sense of empowerment. So if you flip the script and you give people a tool that goes up in value, that isn't a get rich quick scheme, it's a don't get poor slowly
Yeah. Yeah.
solution. I think that allows people to really start to feel like they can save for the future. And when you price things in Bitcoin, what's great is everything's actually getting cheaper
Mhm.
over time. So for younger generations, again, I think it makes the American dream feel like it might be within reach again.
That is very hopeful. And I think it makes a lot of sense because when I think about, the internet of money, that comes so naturally to me. And I think a lot of my peers are like, oh, that makes sense. Things should be more and more digital.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to see where Gen Z takes it. Okay, this is a little bit of an aside, but I recently listened to your episode of Coin Stories. You interviewed Dr. Sean Baker and you discussed the food system.
Yes.
So I was surprised that you even had an episode about food and kind of the movement to make our country healthy again. So I'm curious, like, what's your interest in that specifically, and what does that have to do with Bitcoin and our financial system?
Yeah, I've done a few episodes on it because I
Mhm.
am definitely someone who's health conscious. And one thing that is so interesting about the Bitcoin community is there's a lot of people who are trying to get us back to a place of just focusing on our health, natural remedies, natural solutions,
Mhm.
things like embracing the sunshine and just healthy, natural foods as opposed to all the processed things.
Mhm.
And they've actually connected the dots back to, again, the financial system and the incentives. So there's a great book out there called Fiat Food, and Seyfedina Moose has also done great work on this in his books. But it's basically talking about how when you have a broken monetary system where a few people essentially have more of the power tends to concentrate if you're close to that money printer, you incentivize the creation and establishment of monopolies. And we now, I mean, we see it all around us, right? We have big food, big agriculture, big tech, big pharma. It's a lot harder to form a monopoly in a system where there's way more competition and no one has access to that money printer, because you
Mm.
really have to provide value in order to succeed. But if you are close to the money printer and you could just get cheap lines of credit and buy back your own stock or acquire a competitor, like,
Mhm.
you see how down the road this has tremendous consequences. And you're always kind of worried about the bottom line. How can you make things cheaper? How can you punch up the stock price, right?
Mhm.
And I think that that has led to some really serious consequences in things like our health and food system. It's no longer about providing the best possible service or value to you. It's about, how do I keep the most profit? How do I
Mhm.
keep growing? How do I, make my stock worth a lot, and then therefore benefit the executives of the company? And I think if we introduced a system of consequences again, and of real competition, then we would actually be able to have less of these monopolies and more small businesses that could actually survive, because they're on the same level playing field as everybody else. And we haven't had that for a long time, but I think certainly if folks are watching this who are a little bit older, they can remember a time in America where food was healthier and there were fewer ingredients, and they didn't feel like everything made them sick. And so I think that this is important to address. And this administration has taken it seriously with the Maha movement. But if we don't connect the dots to the incentives within the monetary system, I think a lot of the attempts they're making at fixing the food and health system are not going to be as productive as they want them to be.
So essentially, we need to fix the money before we can actually fix the food system in a enduring way.
I think so. Yes.
Interesting, because this is something I'm personally so passionate about. Like, my family is so tired of me being like, I'm not eating that. It has whatever
Yeah.
seed oil. So
Yeah.
I love it. Our office loves it. And a lot of the young women we work with do. So I think it's really enlightening for them
Yeah.
to be able to see, oh, it's a lot bigger than we realize, which makes sense because big food, big pharma, who have all this power in America, well, maybe it isn't as simple as, oh, it's the cheapest thing. And so Americans will buy it, but there is a bigger issue at play.
Yeah.
So that's really good to know. Okay, we have a couple more minutes, but I think that this would be an interesting thing to talk about is how Bitcoin won't just have an impact on the financial system, but like you're saying, you're suggesting with food, it might affect other areas. So what kind of cultural impact do you think it could have, 20, 30, 50 years down the road?
Well, I think it could be really huge. Again, I think the
Mhm.
downstream effects of both systems are very, very important to examine. So, the fiat system over time has created a greater and greater concentration of wealth. We can see that. It has allowed the cost of living to balloon to an extent that the average person no longer feels like one income is enough. It has created a sense of disconnection between us because, again, I think people are just on that rat race grind so much that it starts to break down. I mean, everything about your spirit, your hope, your sense of duty to one another, right? I think it just incentivizes some of our more I don't know, detrimental behaviors, if you will. We've seen crime go up. We've seen some of these things really play out. Whereas in a system where, again, you are rewarded for value, no one can inflate the supply and no one can gain a special advantage. You have to provide value in order to earn the money, or Bitcoin in this case. And I think that's a world that incentivizes lower time preference, thinking more about the long term, sacrificing in the short term because you want to build something for the future, more cooperation, more innovation. I think it literally flips incentives on its head.
Mm.
And that is a world that can create, oh my gosh, so much abundance that we haven't even seen, right? I mean, right now it feels like all of the capital is held behind this walled garden, and you really have to have access. You have to be close to the money printer. You have to have political access, or you have to be, on Wall Street.
Mhm.
But this is a system where literally, again, a billionaire plays by the same rules as someone who's really poor. The rules are the same because Bitcoin is blind to your net worth. You just
Mhm.
have to provide value in order to earn Bitcoin. And I think that that is something that will actually equalize a lot of the aspects of the world. And it's funny because there's so much, political talk about DEI and how do we make things equal? Well, we're never going to have an equal world, but we can have more opportunity. And then let that opportunity let us see what type of things can be developed and what type of productivity we can really create when everyone feels like they have a seat at the table. That's the world I think Bitcoin can create. And if you look at the actual metrics and the data, wealth tends to concentrate again in the fiat world over time, but wealth tends to distribute over time in Bitcoin as
Mm.
there's still people, who have a ton of Bitcoin early. Over time, they're distributing it, they're letting it go, they're selling it off, and more people are gaining access to Bitcoin. So it's a much more egalitarian system actually than the fiat system ever was.
Wow, that's remarkable because that's exactly what the socialist movement is trying to achieve without all of the natural terrible consequences that that brings about. So
Mhm.
interesting. So
Right.
it's almost this bridge where someone on the right who feels strongly about a smaller controlled government and
Mhm.
also wants the American dream and great opportunity, and then someone on the left who thinks, "Oh, we need to redistribute all this
Right.
wealth."
Right.
So it's kind of a middle ground for people to find some shared interest.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is something that brings us together and bridges this massive divide between
Mhm.
us because it is a neutral technology. And I do think that one reason why so many conservatives have resonated with the message of Bitcoin is it really is about taking agency and about taking responsibility again. It's not about someone handing something to you. It's about you working to earn it, but once you earn it, it is yours. You get to keep it, you can self-custody it, and no one can ever dilute it from you. No one can ever debase you out of your
Mhm.
savings. Whereas in our current system, again, we have no say in it. No matter who gets in office, they have to keep printing money. They can use that money basically however they want, and there's very little accountability despite measures and proposals like Doge and things like
Mhm.
that. And it runs away from you, right? And then all of a sudden it's like you've been working so hard, but your savings have been stolen from you via the theft of inflation. So we need to change that. We need a
Mhm.
system that doesn't have inflation and allows us to really exchange value based on what we find to be valuable and like measure the prices based on something that cannot be controlled by any government organization or group of people that unfortunately we're all fallible. No one's perfect, right? And the
Mhm.
closer you are to the money printer, unfortunately, the more corruption seems to happen.
Mm. Okay, we only have a couple more minutes, so I want to give you a chance to talk about your book,
Sure.
where people can get it, kind of the general premise. We'd love to hear that.
Yeah, so I've pretty much read every single economics book and Bitcoin book out there.
Mm.
And what I wanted to do is kind of condense everything I've learned into something that everyone can understand and walk away, not only just understanding Bitcoin, but our financial system and why this matters to our experiences as humans. That was my goal with it. I wanted it to be for everyone, no matter what your background is, what your age is, what industry you work in. And the beginning of it is a story about the financial system, how it really works, the things that school doesn't teach you. I share some of my personal journey in it and what my family went through, and just what happened in the great financial crisis, which was an inflection point in our country. And then I introduce in the second half Bitcoin, how it works, how to acquire it, some of the frequently asked questions like what about the energy use, and I leave it on a message of real like hope and self-reflection for the reader. So I hope everyone checks it out. It's available at all bookstores and online. You could go to talkingbitcoin.com/book and get it there as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Natalie.
Thank you so much for having me.